I'm really excited about this next presentation, which is called Which League is Best? Using paired comparison models to estimate hockey league strength and project player performance. This is the beginning of a chunk of talks talking about prospects and players who aren't yet in the NHL. This presentation, guys, if you can take your seats and be quieter, please. Thank you. Katerina Wu is an undergraduate student in her senior year at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. She is majoring in economics and double minoring in computer science and statistical analysis. Her research interests include labor economics and the effect of long-term guaranteed contracts on player performance. This past summer, she was part of the Carnegie Mellon Sports Analytics Camp, and when she is not avidly watching hockey, she enjoys hiking and playing badminton. Please join me in welcoming Katerina.
Hello, everyone. My name is Katerina Wu. Oh, it's not showing.
Hey, Jim. It's not showing.
So today I will be presenting on building and using paired comparison models to estimate hockey league strength from around the world. Once this loads, I will continue. Cool. Before I get started, I'd just like to briefly thank the other contributors to this project. I worked on this with my partner, Madeline Gall, over the summer at the Carnegie Mellon Sports Analytics Camp. We worked in collaboration with the Pittsburgh Penguins Hockey Analytics Department, led by Sam Ventura, and this would not have been possible without everyone's help. So since we're in Columbus, I thought I would do a timely example. This is a bit of a throwback, though. So 2016 NHL draft, the Columbus Blue Jackets held the 3rd overall pick, and the question at the time was which player would they choose? The general consensus at the time was that Jesse Puljujarvi, a Finnish forward from the European League Liga, was going to go 3rd overall. But then Columbus surprised everyone instead by choosing Pierre-Luc Dubois, a French-Canadian team from the Quebec Major Junior Hockey League. And obviously, he's doing really well right now, so I'm sure Columbus has no regrets. But at the time, this was a slightly controversial decision and led to some debate about which player was better and how do we compare these players. And that's a really good question because it's kind of difficult to compare these players across different leagues. Some of the differences are listed on the left, and it's kind of hard to make like apples to apples comparison when they're playing in such vastly different situations. And it kind of boils down to the question of how do you compare a player, an 18-year-old playing against other 18-year-olds in a minor league compared to an 18-year-old playing against veteran players in a professional hockey league. And obviously, we're not the first to try to tackle this problem. There have been many previous approaches. One that we took a lot of inspiration from were NHLE and translation factors by Gabriel Desjardins and Rob Volman. And you've probably seen something like the table on the right by Hockey Abstract. And these like translation factors are really good for league to NHL predictions. And what that means is that you can take like the points of a certain player in a certain league, like the KHL, and then you multiply it by the translation factor, and then you get their prediction for the NHL performance. And this is really easy to understand and pretty simple to calculate. You just multiply. But there obviously are some drawbacks to this as well. For starters, there's the problem of a selection bias because these translation factors are calculated using using data from players who have moved from one league to the NHL. And obviously, to even get to the NHL, you have to be a certain caliber. So Obviously that has some selection bias into it. And it also doesn't control for things like age, player quality, the opportunity that a player gets, like how much they get to play, what the position they are, etc. And one of the biggest things is that it doesn't utilize data about intermediate league transitions, because typically players just don't usually move from the minor league directly to the NHL. There's some other transitions between that as well. And that's just a lot of data that's not being used. So we try to improve upon this approach by controlling for factors like age, position, league, and season. And something that's good about our method is that it can be applied to any league of your choice, not just leagues where players have moved to the NHL, but as long as you have data, you could use this method. It makes comparisons between all these different leagues, not just league to NHL, but like OHL to AHL to KHL, like whatever league to league comparison you wish to make. And this is really great because it can track league strength over time in relation to each other. So to begin, still using the Dubois example, this is kind of what our data looked like. We had over 300,000 player league season observations straight from EliteHockeyProspects.com. And one of the first questions we had to tackle was, what statistic can we use to measure player performance? Now, in the NHL, we obviously have a vast variety of ways that we could measure player performance, like expected goals and other things like that. But that's just not the case for other leagues because they just don't have the data available. But what we did have was the total points that a player got a season and the number of games they played. So we used points per game. It's kind of simple, but pretty straightforward. And then we did a simple transformation on it, and we calculated the mean and standard deviation grouped by league, age, position, and season for each player. And then, so like basically we calculated a z-score for each player. And then using the z-score, we could start to build paired comparison observations. Now in the first table, still using Dubois as an example, we can see that he's played in two separate leagues, the Q and the NHL. And we can see his z-score for each league. And then moving from the first table to the second table, we're moving from player level to league level. So now we're just comparing the Q to the NHL by the z-score of Dubois. And then we can calculate the difference in the z-score. And from the second table to the third table, we're basically just simplifying it. And then we see that the NHL is is the better league, and the Q is obviously the worst league. And we mark that whichever one is better by 1, and whichever one is worse by -1. And we also still keep the difference. And then we aggregate this for every single player, for every single transition, and we come up with something that kind of looks like this data matrix. The zeros basically just mean that league wasn't taken into consideration for the comparison. And then you still have the difference on the far right. And from the data matrix, we can start to build our model. The model's purpose is basically to answer which league is harder to play in, and we ultimately want to arrive at coefficients for league strength. And still using the difference in z-scores as our response variable. This might seem a little bit backwards, but the lower the z-score, we count that as the better league because we consider that to be more difficult to score in that league. And then we ran various models and regressions. If I have time, I'll go over the model selection and evaluation process. But for now, we basically ultimately chose the ordinary least squares regression because it had the best predictive accuracy for league strength. And we found that basically after we ran the regressions, we ended up with strength coefficients for each league, for each year. And if we plot it out over time, it looks something like this. And the highlighted leagues, in our data set, we had like over 45 leagues from around the world. And if I plotted all of those, it would just look like a huge mess. So just some of the ones that we've highlighted here are just like some of the major leagues. And along the vertical axis, you can see the strength coefficients for that league. And we did this for around the past 10 seasons from 2008 to 2018. And on the very top, you can obviously see the NHL is best. So that answers the question. I'm done. Okay, just kidding. What else can we do with this? So there's a lot you can do with this, actually. You can compare for player statistics already just using the z-score. That's pretty straightforward. But something that I think is really interesting is that you can compare league strength, as in you can compare similar leagues. And this is really great because obviously if you compare like a minor league to the NHL, obviously the NHL is the best, so like who cares? But you can try to see how these leagues do in comparison to each other. So still using the Quebec Major Junior Hockey League, here it is compared to other North American junior leagues. And from this graph, you can see that it's not the best junior league in North America, the OHL is. However, it still does pretty well. And it does a lot better in comparison to newer leagues like the British Columbia Hockey League. And we could see something similar for Liga. It's like a middling tier league compared to other professional hockey leagues around the world, but it does do pretty consistently in terms of ranking against these other professional hockey leagues, and this just gives a better context as to how these leagues perform in relation to each other. One other thing that you could do with this is a scouting implementation. So perhaps you're a scout and you're interested in seeing how a player performs in relation to another player, or you might want to see how a player would perform in one league transitioning to another. Still using the Dubois versus Pugliarvi example, it's like very possible that the Columbus Scouts had something similar to this, in which they would compare to see how Pugliarvi and Dubois would do if they transitioned to another league. And this is still using the z-scores, but as you can see, Dubois is the navy blue dot, and he consistently did better than Pugliarvi in various leagues. And you can kind of like maybe this was just one of the factors that they took into consideration when they chose Dubois. I'm sure there's other things like his physicality and his size that they really liked. But I think that this gives a better context as to how, which player that they might have preferred. And in conclusion, we could see like our model creates these strength coefficients that allows us to compare these different hockey leagues. We see that the NHL is the best league, so that answers that question. Certain leagues do still perform better depending on whether or not we account for age, which is part of why we did that. I have an additional graph that I could probably show later on. These coefficients can be used to find comparisons for all these different leagues of similar strength, or gauge player strength in separate leagues. So like with the upcoming draft, a lot of people say Lafreniere is like the next McDavid or something. We could actually calculate that using this model to see if that's true or not, and see if he will have that same impact. And another great thing about this is that it's really flexible for other kinds of data as well. So obviously, my data was rather limited to publicly available data. But if an NHL team would like to use this model for like using proprietary data like scout rankings or something, they could feel free to contact me. And I'm a senior, so like if you want to reach out, here's my Twitter and email. But since I have just a little bit more time, I just want to say something really interesting about the age thing. So as you can see, that like really far out of light blue dot is the Minnesota High School League, and if we don't account for age, they're like by far the worst league possible. But if we do account for age, they're like so bad, but like not as bad compared to other leagues. So that's part of the reasons why we accounted for factors like age and season league. So yeah, okay, cool, thanks.
Awesome stuff. All right.